Clannad is something I've been meaning to get to for years, either in the visual novel or anime series form. And I just kind of kept putting it off because it didn't really look like my sort of thing exactly. In addition to that, it also is just really long. The visual novel's super long, the TV show's super long. I had started both a couple times and then I just kind of lost interest after a little bit and dropped it. But I decided it was about time to just sit down and watch the whole thing because it is one of those kind of classic, iconic anime series. If I remember correctly, the visual novel came out in the early 2000s, and it was extremely influential, and it's something people still talk about and recommend, and that sort of thing. I guess it's a bit like Ava in that regard, or Sailor Moon, or Gundam, or Astro Boy, or any of these kind of animes that really contributed a lot to the development of the genre. And it kind of reminds me a bit of Lord of the Rings, if you can forgive that reference, in that if you go back and read Tolkien's work, some of it can feel kind of generic and derivative, which is because other stuff copied it or drew inspiration for it. And at the time, it was very original. But looking back on it, if you've read a whole bunch of like Dragonlance or D&D stuff, it does seem kind of generic in retrospect. Once again, that's not because of any fault of Tolkien, because he was crafting it basically by himself, but just because people copied it afterwards. And from when Clan came out, I feel like that's something that probably happened here, where at the time a lot of this stuff was probably very new and innovative. But because it was new and innovative, and a lot of it was really the first time it was being done, modern incarnations are more polished or deconstructed or add in a bit more flavor. So it can kind of come across as being a bit bland. What I'm just trying to say is I don't really think that's a fault of the work. It's just something that I think is kind of unavoidable whenever you're watching it. So Clannad's a very divisive series. While most people like it, there are a lot of people who hate it. Some people think it's the best thing ever. Some people think it's very subversive emotionally, and it's excessively sentimental, or it's the term that I like to use, emotional pornography. And I think most of those criticisms are accurate. I also think most of the people who say good things about it, that it's well written, that it is very heartwarming and wholesome, that it does a really good job of being a slice of life thing, of keeping consistent themes throughout. I think those people are also right. So, in short, it's there's a friend of mine, Terrellian, who I occasionally have on here, and he has his own YouTube channel. So he said to me, he goes, Argent, I have the most controversial opinion on Evangelion. There's people who hate it, there's people who love it, there's people who have mixed opinions on it. I think it's okay. It's not exactly my thing. I appreciate it for what it is. I enjoyed it. It's not anything really special to me. And that's kind of how I feel about Clannad. It's not like great to me. It's not bad. It was okay. It was a bit of a mixed bag in some regards. I don't regret watching it. I probably wouldn't ever watch it again. But I was entertained enough. There are some parts that really dragged, but I just thought it was okay. And maybe that's the most controversial opinion at all, because that doesn't make any of the major sides happy. So, one of the reasons I hadn't done this review earlier is I can't really talk that much about the story because it's just so long and there's so many subplots and twists and turns and stuff like that. It's part kind of like why I've never done a review of Inuyasha, despite being a really big fan of it back in the day and watching like 160 episodes of it. I just don't even know how I would even tackle something that long and try to cover the plot progression or anything like that. And I feel kind of that way with Clannad. It's such a big thing. Like, where do you even start? How do you even attempt to cover something like this? So I think I'm just going to maybe talk about it in very broad terms. So I think my biggest single issue with this series is part one and part two feel very disconnected to me. Now, I've talked to friends of mine, and they disagree with me strongly on this point, and I get where they're coming from. But to me, I feel like the first half, and I get that part of it is just to show change and growing up, and those are core themes of it. But you go through all these plot arcs, introducing all these side characters, the different girls. You have Sunahara, his like best friend, and they're all like super important. And then in part two, they barely show up or have anything to do with the plot. And I get that that's kind of what they were going for. Is Tomoya's graduated, he's sort of moved on with his life to a certain extent. And that's kind of what happens after high school. You lose contact with your friends and that sort of thing. I just don't know if that makes for necessarily a very good or satisfying story progression. Because in order for part two to work, Tomoya has to feel very isolated and alone and not have a very strong support system like he had back in high school. But it kind of makes it feel like a lot of what happened previously doesn't really matter. And I get that it wasn't an ass pull and it wasn't something that they just came up with at the last minute, but it kind of feels like that. Where at the end, there's all the orbs of light from all the people he helped and all the people who he made happy. And that was trying to tie all the events of the rest of the series together. But it just felt a little bit forced to me. And this show definitely had what's known as a Gainax ending. Gainax ending because mainly from Evangelion, but I think also some of the other series, like His or Her Circumstances, had one. And that's just where, like, the genre completely shifts. The whole thing is just one big mind fuck. You don't know what's going on. It's just very tonally different and just sudden, and it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. Like, other than Evangelion, I'd say some other Gainax endings. Darling in the Franxx, I think, is a really good example. Uh, Kill la Kill is another example. I'm just looking at a trope list. Berserk had a Gainax ending. Um, I would definitely say that. Once again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but Clannad definitely, I think, in my opinion, has one, and it's just kind of weird. But given the rest of the show, but yeah, like I said, it's kind of hard because the first half is like a bunch of multi-episode plot arcs where like new girls come up and they help them resolve their personal issues, and then like Sunahara is gets his own plot arc, and I found they varied pretty wildly in quality. Like I thought Sunahara's and Kotomi's and uh some of Nagisa's were okay, some of them were not that great. I thought Fuko's was not very good. Um Sagara's with the like cat that transforms into the human was like super depressing. I just found it was kind of a mixed bag. Some of them worked, some of them kind of didn't work. I'd say kind of one of my big criticisms of the series as a whole is they kind of needed to take a machete to it. I just think it's too long. I think they probably could have shortened it significantly. Like, the show is 47 episodes, I think, and they probably could have gotten it down to 40 pretty easily, and it would have flowed a lot better. And it just kind of felt at times like they were trying to get as much of the visual novel into it as possible. And it probably could have been cleaned up a bit and made a bit more concise. And once again, that's just a personal preference. That's not necessarily kind of an objective criticism. I think it would have been better if it was a bit briefer. And sorry to compare this to Lord of the Rings again, but that's kind of a criticism I have of that. Is I think if Tolkien had an editor and they maybe would have shaved about 15% of it off or something, the series would just, the flow would have been improved a bit. That's not really a criticism of his writing, it's just a personal preference on my point. And I've seen other people say that kind of thing in the past as well. So I guess maybe I'll try talking a little bit about the characters. It's very hard, like I said, because there's so many of them. It's so dense. Every frame has so much going on. So the main protagonist of the show is Tomaya, and the main girl of the show is Nagisa. So Tomaya, I didn't really like as much as a lot of, I guess, kind of protagonists in this. Generally speaking, there's two kinds of protagonists I like in these kind of slice of life shows. Either the case where the main character is kind of a reliable delta male, if you'll forgive that cringe, where he's just an all around really stand up guy. He might not be the most successful, he might not be the most like Chad or athletic guy, but he's just fundamentally a really good, reliable person who's there for the main girl and who people appreciate because of his steadfast nature. So, Sutsui from Real Girl's an example of that. I forget his name. The main character of Toradora is like that. The main character of You Never Thought There Was a Girl Online is like that. And I'm sure there's others I'm forgetting. And then there's the guy who's the super Chad. He's like really good at everything. He's just kind of a male power fantasy guy. It generally works especially if he's like a really nice guy too. So that would be like Arama from Karakino or Usui from Maid Sama or something like that. And I also like that protagonist. Tomoya is kind of like the third type you find in that, who's kind of a loser. And I think they were going for a bit of the Delta male thing. Like he gets a working class job and he wants to provide for his family and he's there for Nagisa and other sorts of stuff. But I just found he was kind of too much of a loser, and I didn't really get why all the women liked him. Because obviously, in any anime series, there's going to be, especially a slice of life, all the girls in it are going to have a crush on the main character to greater or lesser degrees. And whereas I think it worked in something like Welcome to the NHK, and Welcome to the NHK is somewhat similar to this in terms of its themes, but I think is just done a lot better. Although comparing something to Welcome to the NHK is kind of unfair just because it's such a it's one of the best anime series of all time. But it's kind of hard to describe. I just didn't find him particularly interesting or likable, or that sort of thing. So I don't know. Tomoya is okay, I guess. He was not my favorite. I didn't particularly like him. I had mixed feelings. I liked some of the female characters. I'd say my favorite female character was Tomoyo, and I kind of wish that they had given them different names because I kept getting Tomoya and Tomoyo, or however you pronounce them, mixed up throughout, and that was kind of obnoxious. I liked her. I liked Kyo. I liked Katomi. Some of the other characters were kind of annoying. And then you have Nagisa I have mixed feelings about. I don't like her as much as a lot of kind of slicer life female leads. Like I like Aroha a lot more. I like Misaki a lot more. I like Stella a lot more. But she is likable enough. I think that they were going to make her a little annoying in terms of just being a bit of a helpless damsel in distress figure. So I think the dynamic of her and Tomoya's relationship is she's kind of someone who needs someone to take care of her, and he's someone who needs someone to take care of to give his life kind of purpose and direction. Nagisa is very much there's a trope called adorkable where the character kind of acts like a dork. Yukiko is also kind of an example of that to a certain extent in Persona 4, where they can be naive or stupid or have a weird laugh, or they have a couple quirky things that are very much dorky or unattractive, but because it's like a cute girl and it contrasts well with the rest of their personality, it's more kind of endearing than it is anything more than it detracts from them. So Nagisa is very adorkable. I like her parents a lot. Her mother Sanai is really likable. I really like her father. He's kind of a Chad. He's just a very good like patriarch, like the head of the family who wants to protect his wife and daughter. There's a really good episode or two in the second half where, in order to marry Nagisa, I think he has to hit a pitch from her father, and he's just like completely and utterly determined to have that happen. And that was good. And generally speaking, as I think I said earlier, the second half is a lot better. It's a lot more focused. There's fewer characters. I know I kind of criticized it from them removing a bunch of characters in part two, but my issue was more that they introduced a bunch and then didn't really follow up on them, rather than there not being more. I mean, that's one of the things I liked about Real Girls so much, is they established the cast in like the first couple episodes, and they didn't keep adding like a bunch of random side characters as time went on. On that note, something else I kind of liked is Nagisa and Tomoya were established as the canon couple in the first episode. And I don't watch harem. I can't do it. Maybe it's weird a bit of me complaining about degeneracy or sexual morality when I watch anime, but I just can't do it. The idea of being in a relationship with multiple women at the same time is so repulsive to me. I just can't take it. There is kind of a variant of it that they call supporting harem, where the MC is only interested in one girl, and then there's a bunch of other girls who are interested in him, which doesn't really bother me. And this happens in a lot of shows. Isekai is like in particular kind of an example of this. Maybe Sword Art Online is like the ultimate example of this, because Kirito never really expresses any interest in anyone other than Asuna, but there's all these other girls who have a crush on him. So it's like called supporting harem or unwanted harem or something like that. Now that I think about it, there's kind of an example of that in reverse in Snow White with the red hair, where the main character has a whole bunch of guys who are interested in her because of her beauty and because she's kind and just a very impressive woman overall. But she's only really interested in Zen, and she doesn't really consider the affections of any of the other males. So once again, it's just that doesn't really bother me in the same way that it would be if Tomoya. I guess it would make him kind of a Chad if he was like doing like all the hottest girls in his school at the same time, but it's just not for me. Sorry if this is a bit rambling. I just kind of had a bunch of smaller points I wanted to address because it's just the plot is too long for really me to go into it. Um, I guess I should talk about the main theme of the show because I really haven't talked about that very much at all. So, the main theme of the show is basically change and growing up. And it does do a pretty good job of that. It's established very early on that things are constantly in flux, that you can't hold on to high school forever. And Tomoya is really a character who's really bad at accepting change, especially because in high school his life gets progressively better, and then it kind of ends, and he's kind of cast out into the real world and has to try to get a job and provide for his family and stuff like that. And you just kind of see this throughout. Tomoyo wants to become student council president just to maintain the trees. There's that part where the park or whatever gets bulldozed to build a hospital. Throughout, you see that the small town they live in is rapidly developing into a major city, and a lot of the characters just have different feelings about that. And I suppose like I said, the major theme is change and learning to accept change, and Tomoya being someone who can't deal with it very well, and him kind of trying to learn about it, which I think is pretty good. My biggest issue, I think, is just that the series is very emotionally manipulating. Um, I don't think that's really questionable. Like, there's a lot of times where it just gets so sappy and so waffy or so like tugging on your heartstrings, it actually becomes kind of cringy. I mean, a lot of time it succeeds, but a lot of the time it just goes way too far. And like I said, you just kind of cringe and you're just like, oh, could this just be over? Could we get back to something else? That sort of thing. So I think that's a pretty legitimate criticism that some people have of that show. So I guess that's about all I have to say about Clannad. Sorry if it wasn't more detailed. I wanted to do a review of this. I just really didn't know how to even like begin to cover this, what order to cover this in, or anything else. So I hope you enjoyed the review. I hope you found it interesting. Feel free to post below. Overall, if it's your thing, I'd watch it. If it's not your thing, I'd say don't watch it. Although, like me, you might just want to watch it because it's such an iconic, major, big series. But that's about all I have to say. God bless, and I'll talk to you guys later.